together a funeral, putting together the eulogy or what have you for somebody that's close to you, the loss is hard. You know, the challenge emotionally to stand in front of people and bury somebody that is, you know, especially close to you is a challenge. As far as putting the message together, then that message generally comes a lot easier to, you know, if somebody, a total stranger, and you've got to, you know, spend time with, you know, and I got to look at 1/3 of, or more than 1/3 of the funerals I've preached have been for people I never met, not the first time. And when you do a funeral for somebody you've never met before, you know, you're trying to not only find out who they are, but to find out who they are in such a way that you can share with people who do know who they are, in a way that gives their life some meaning and some death and some meaning to their death. And so, you know, trying to find out what to say is the challenge. Whereas when it's somebody you know, the challenge is what not to say. You know, what do I need to cut out of this funeral? What to not say? Because there's so many things you could say, so many stories you could share, and you know, the big challenge in is just, you know, what's the bare minimum to get by in here and really do them justice. I'm going to jump right into this next section. I'm going to talk about preparations for a good funeral, and we'll give you some practical stuff. Now, like I said, if you've got a minister's manual, that minister's manual is going to tell you a lot of things that you should do, you know, as a pastor, and be prepared for this, and that, and the other. And so, obviously, you know, I leaned heavily. I think I bought my first minister's manual when I was about 16 years old, long before I, you know, did my first wedding or funeral. I bought a book and was at least, you know, thinking down the road. But, you know, and we gleaned, and like I said, since then I've had 3 or 4 others, and I've bought books specifically on conducting weddings or conducting funerals. But, you know, being thrown into it and I've learned a whole lot more. Just because one of the things, the manual's there to guide you, but every situation is different. Every funeral is different. Now, I'm going to start with this little illustration. I'm going to share this story and then get into the rest of this. Before I ever preached my first funeral, I'd been pastoring the church for about a month or 2, and there was a death in the community, and one of my pastor friends in our organization, his wife's aunt lived right down the road from our church, and she passed away. Great aunt. And they were all coming in for the funeral. This was you didn't know these people. I just went because of a pastor friend, a connection. Went to that funeral, and the minister was not a local minister. He had been a local minister at one time. She was an older woman, probably in her 70s or 80s. Went to one of the churches here in town. Church choir was there to sing, and the former pastor had been invited back to conduct that funeral. He got up at the beginning of the eulogy and he said this, and I'll never forget it. He said, "There's a world of difference in a funeral, and Jesus makes all the difference in the world." And then he read from Proverbs chapter 31. He preached a sermon on the virtuous woman and eulogized this particular former member of his congregation. 2 months later, one of our church members' grandmother died. And I was back down at the same funeral home, same church membership. They brought in the same church choir, and the same 2 ministers participated in that funeral that participated in the, you know, that shouldn't surprise you. 2 members of the same congregation, same cast of characters. But what really struck me is at the beginning of his eulogy, that pastor from out of town that came back to perform that service, he got up and he said this. He said, "There's a world of difference in funerals, and Jesus makes all the difference in the world." And then he read Proverbs chapter 31, and he preached a sermon on the virtuous woman. What are you saying? I'm saying that, you know, here I was at 2 different funerals that strangely, and I didn't know either one of the individuals, but the funeral felt very strangely, eerily. I probably wouldn't have remembered, it probably wouldn't have made such an impact, except for the fact that I felt like I was at exactly the same service. Same, you know, maybe they had the same, I don't know if they had the same hymns or didn't have, but the eulogy itself was the same. And so we were talking earlier about you know, about saving funerals. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Saving those funerals. But here's the key: is, you know, make sure you're meeting the needs of this particular family. Every situation is different, and there are going to be some funerals that are easy funerals. Good church members that love God for many years. They, you know, their death was natural. They just lived a long time. Their body wore out. They went home to be with Jesus. And we mourn their loss, but we celebrate that heaven is their gain, and we lean on the Lord for comfort to face the future. You know, there's nothing complicated about that. And then there's going to be other funerals where family dynamics are going to, or the circumstances, the death, are going to create situations. I did one graveside service where we got to the cemetery. They were burying the individual, you know, on family land behind the house, and a member of the family came out from a neighbor. A member of the family came out to meet the funeral procession before the grieving family even got out of the car. A neighbor came out and said, "You are not going to bury them in that yard." And then got in a fight, and somebody pulled a knife on somebody. We had to call the sheriff to come before we could ever get up and finish the committal service. I'm telling you, anything can happen. You know, you better be prepared for you know, be prepared. Just pray. You know, that's all you can say sometimes. But let me talk about. There's nothing I can say today that will prepare you for a situation like that at the cemetery. But I'm going to talk about just making some preparations for a good funeral. I want to talk first of all about preparing the preparation that takes place before the funeral arrangements are made. So what do you do in the time between any time before the funeral arrangements are made? So let's kind of start by talking about that. First of all, I want to say build relationships with the living. The most effective way to minister to people is through personal relationships. You're going to be a much more effective funeral minister if you have a relationship with people who are who you're eulogizing when the time comes. And there's no substitute for those personal relationships. When you know, when sometimes we're called upon to do a funeral for somebody we've never met before. We'll talk a little bit about, you know, the particulars of that kind of funeral in just a little bit. But by and large, your best funerals are going to be now they may be the most difficult funerals for you personally when you've had a personal relationship, a close relationship with somebody. I've mentioned to some folks on occasion when I've done a funeral for somebody that was especially close to me, and they talk about, oh, I know that funeral's got to be hard. Actually, those funerals are much easier to put together. The funeral itself is much easier. The loss is harder, and sometimes trying to deal with your own emotions maybe is a challenge. But as far as putting a funeral together, the closer you are to someone, the easier that it should be. The challenge is going to be when you're preparing a funeral message, maybe for somebody that's real close to you. The challenge is not going to be trying to find things to say. The challenge is going to be what not to say. There's so many stories you want to tell. And you just don't have time in a funeral to do that. So build a relationship with people. The second thing is, you know, the best sermons and eulogies at funerals are given by people who know the deceased extremely well. So long before people are sick, or people are dying, or people have died, have a relationship. Be a people person. Jesus was a people person, and forming those relationships is going to be the first step towards helping yourself in dealing with funeral preparation. I want to talk also about ministry to the terminally ill. Sometimes your ministry, you know, to do a funeral or what have begins as somebody is dying. You know, you've been notified. So I want to talk a little bit about that when you minister to those who are terminally ill. Have your relationship with the person who is ill or with their family to determine the nature of your ministry to them. You know, your relationship with someone who is dying or your relationship with that family ought to determine how you respond. You know, sometimes you'll get a phone call from somebody that is a family member that said, hey, we just got the doctors just called the family in, whatever, we would like for you to come down. If you're invited to come down, if the family calls you and tells you, we would like for you to come down, say a prayer or whatever, then by all means go. If you have the ability, go. If you can get there, then get there, and minister to the family. Now, once you get there, again, your own relationship and your own discernment will tell you how long to stay. Sometimes the family just kind of, it's perfectly appropriate, and what they want is for you to come down, say a prayer, with the family. Just remind them that the Lord's with them. Pray with the deceased. If the person who is dying is not a Christian, then and they know they're dying. It certainly may be appropriate to talk about their soul and maybe lead them to the Lord, or pray a sinner's prayer with them, or if they're sometimes the sick patient, the dying patient is not even responsive, and so your ministry is not to them as much as it is to the family. Just reminding them. Just your being there reminds them that the Lord is there. You are representing the presence of the Lord. And having a man of God present reminds them that the God of man is also present. And so, again, determine your relationship with the family. Don't ever overstay your welcome. Sometimes the family wants you there. They want you to stay. They want you to be with them when someone has died. Or when someone passes away, the family wants you. And then other times, that passing of a loved one is something that's very, very private, and it may be that it's appropriate just for the immediate family to be there. And so you get your own discernment, your own common sense or wisdom should give you some feel for how when I'm called upon in a situation like that, I want to know how useful I am. I try to measure whether or not I'm really useful or whether or not I'm in the way. Sometimes you get a phone call and it's not the family that's calling you. You're just told about someone who is dying. And again, it's my relation. It's the nature of my relationship with that person or that family that tells me whether or not I should go or not go. Death is a very intimate thing, and sometimes that should be the immediate family. There have been times that I have been present with someone who passed away, and I felt a little uncomfortable being there. But at the same time, I looked around and there were people that I thought, I know if I feel out of place and I shouldn't be here right now, I know you shouldn't be here. So there's always somebody that's there that maybe was just kind of tagging along or whatever. But don't invade into anybody's space. Into that intimate moment. Sometimes people are dying at home, hospice patients or what have you. And generally speaking, again, if the family calls me and invites me to come down, wants me to come down, I'll do whatever I can to minister to the family any way that I can minister to the family. But if somebody else calls and says, hey, so-and-so, it's not looking good, I just talked to whoever, it's a friend of a friend that's called me, that don't always give me the liberty to just go down. My relationship with the family is going to tell me what to do. Maybe somebody at home was just real busy, didn't have time to call the minister, or whatever the case is. But I have this tendency that if I've never been in someone's home when they're living, then I'm not going to show up when they're dying. You know what I mean? Your relation, there are some people you are comfortable in their homes. There's some people that, when you're invited and you've been in their home before, you're comfortable enough that, you sit down or whatever, you take your shoes off when you come in, or, some people you're even familiar enough, you can get up and go to the, refrigerator and help yourself to, a Coca-Cola out of their fridge. Those are the kind of people that, you probably ought to go to. You should have to think about whether or not if you're that comfortable in their home where they're living, then yeah, by all means. But if it's somebody whose home you've never been in, you're certainly not that familiar with them, then maybe you ought to err on the side of giving the family the privacy that they need. We'll talk about making the initial contact. with the families. Again, before any funeral arrangements are made, when someone dies, what do you do? And again, your relationship with the family ought to determine your immediate response. If a family member has called, sometimes you get a call from a family at the hospital. They said, "Hey, Dad just passed away. We wanted to let you know." And sometimes it's a death that was expected. You were waiting on a phone call. Sometimes it's a call in the middle of the night. Those emergency phone calls in the middle of the night that were unexpected deaths, they tend to be the ones that cause you to react more quickly. But when somebody in the family is calling and says, "Hey, so-and-so just passed away, Dad just died, or we just lost Mom," or whatever, then again your relationship ought to tell you a little bit of something. I generally will ask, if it's not something that I just know, sometimes I'll say I'll be right there. Other times I'll ask, do you all need me to come down? Depending on your schedule, what you're doing, where you're at, and which hospital they're at, or if they're at home. And so I'll just ask, or maybe it's not the family that's called. They've called some close friend or someone else who is theirs made the call to the minister. And again, I'll ask, do they need me to come down there? And so your relationship will determine that immediate response. And sometimes a phone call is appropriate, and sometimes showing up is appropriate. So again, it's going to there's not a cookie cutter response to that just is across the board. But always, whether you're making that initial contact via phone, or whether you're making that initial contact by showing up at the hospital, or maybe waiting till sometimes you'll ask, "Do I need to come on down there?" And there's the funeral home's getting ready to come, and we're going to go home. They're not going to be there much longer. Depending on where they're at in that process, you get to call right after someone has passed away. Maybe they've not even notified the funeral home yet, or it's at home, maybe a hospice patient. They've not even called hospice yet. Sometimes, especially in our area, it may take a hospice nurse an hour to get there. You may go ahead and go on down and just, again, whatever you do, whether it's a phone call or a visit to the home or to the hospital, always offer your sympathy and offer your prayer. And certainly, in a lot of cases, it's appropriate to pray with the family before you leave them. You just gather the family together and to spend a little time in prayer. And then offer to assist the grieving family in any way that you can. Is there anything that I can do? And sometimes that is about immediate needs. What is there that I can do right now? Is there somebody that I can telephone? Is there what can I do to help in any way? Making yourself available. The last thing when someone has just passed away, the last thing you need to do is start asking, "Well, do you want me to preach the funeral?" They've not even went to make arrangements. Maybe they've not even thought about it yet. And now again, sometimes the family will start talking. If it's someone that they've been expecting to die, maybe they've been talking about funeral arrangements. They may start talking about that. They may start asking about funeral homes, or they may ask you about a funeral home or what have you in that phone call. But let their needs dictate your response. You're there to assist the family, not to push them through. And then the last thing about this initial contact, if you make the length of your stay practical. I stay as long as I'm needed, as long as I'm necessary. If there's a point in time when I get the feeling that the prayer that I pray or whatever is going to be sufficient, then I excuse myself and leave the family leave the family to do the work of grief that they're going to need to do, and also make the preparations that they're going to need to make. Sometimes the family's going to want to talk about things, and they don't need people outside the family present to talk about things like life insurance, or to talk about the particular desires of the deceased and funeral arrangements and what they're going to do and how they're going to do it and things like that. And sometimes there's tension and so make the length of your stay very practical. And then I want to talk about following up with the family. but again, prior to the time that the arrangements are made. You made an initial contact, whether it's by telephone. You make that call and say, "Hey, I'm sorry to hear about, I'm sorry to hear about your dad," or or whatever the case is, or sorry to hear about your child. What can we do? I want you to know we're praying for you. Is there anything we can do in the meantime? And then a follow-up. Usually that would be the next day, or sometimes if there's a death early in the morning, maybe it's a follow-up a little later on in the day. You're going to make a follow-up phone call or a follow-up visit to the home. And so ascertain in what ways you may assist the family with preparation and planning the funeral. By now, by the time you make this second call, this follow-up, by now they've had time to process mentally and emotionally the death that's taken place, and so they're moving forward. The funeral home by now has the body, and so whether they've made the appointment yet with the funeral home to go down and make the arrangements, or whether they've not made that, they at least know where they're going, and so you can learn. And again, the question is not to steer them to volunteer yourself. Hey, I'm your man, but to ask what can we do? What do you need us to do? And probably by this point in time, they're going to tell you. The family's going to let you know. And a lot of times when you show up immediately after death, sometimes family members will say, if they've even thought about the funeral, they'll say, well, we want you to have a part in the funeral, or this follow-up visit. You'll get an idea right away whether or not the family intends to include you, whether or not they need you to be a part. But you'll learn as you meet with them in what ways you can help them with the planning of the funeral. If you're pastoring a church and you think the church or the family may want to use the facilities, the church building for the funeral, have the funeral there, or the fellowship hall, or to have a dinner or a gathering, then ask those things. Make that available. Some people want to go to the church. Some people, that's the last thing they want to do. If the person who has died had a special connection to the church, or the family feels the church is a vital part of their life, sometimes they feel comfort in going to the church. Some families don't. But make that available. That, hey, the church is available if you all would like to use it. The fellowship hall is available if you'd like to use it. If they don't want to use the fellowship hall, they want to have maybe food brought to the house or something. You're learning how the church can serve them. And it may be that, if they don't need the fellowship hall, maybe they need some tables and chairs out of the fellowship hall. So you can find out what you can do to help. And then also begin activating the church community support network. So as you're learning and you've made a contact with the family and offered your sympathy and support, then begin to activate the church body, and that's going to you should be notifying whoever in the church is responsible for ordering flowers, or whoever is responsible for organizing food to be brought to the house, whether it's food that's brought over the next couple of days, or whether it's a dinner that's organized after the funeral. It's about letting those people know, even if you don't have all the details. You may not know when you're going to cook yet. You may not know when the service is. You may not know a lot of stuff, but at least make aware the church family, so that, first of all, so that they can be prepared. Some people don't have the extra food laying in the house or whatever to cook for a funeral dinner, and they may need time to go to the grocery store, and so they need to know that someone has died and that we're going to be cooking, or let them know so that they can be praying for this family. They can offer their own sympathy and support in ways that are meaningful, and then clearly determine what your role, if any, will be in the funeral services. And so, as you're following up with, maybe they said something to you about, hey, we want you to have a part in the funeral or whatever. This, you need to clearly determine what it is that the family would like for you to do, and then make preparations to start doing it. Sometimes the family will say things, like, well, maybe they've asked several ministers, maybe there's several ministers that are close to the family, and sometimes the family will say, well, you got whatever you all want to do is fine with me. Well, the truth is, it matters to them. They just don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And so, and for by and large, that really, so determine what, what role, and offer your willingness to assist in any way possible. It's an honor. It is an honor to be asked by anybody to participate in a funeral service in any way. And whether that's being a pallbearer, or whether that's delivering the eulogy, or anything that you might consider in between, participating in a funeral and to honor someone's life, it really is an honor. And so determine what role the family would like for you to, and if they say, well, we want you, we want all three of you to preach. Well, the truth is they don't, and even if they do, you shouldn't. So, determine what role, what do I need to do to help with this. And sometimes those roles, sometimes those answers will be self-explanatory. And sometimes your own wisdom will tell you to defer, when to defer to someone else. Cole, do you have a question?
Well, it was along the same lines as that. Like, say they do say, we don't really care. They try not to hurt anyone's feelings. But how should they? Should the ministers just decide amongst themselves, or should you try and pull it out of them? What do you really
there is a preference from somebody in that family who should deliver the eulogy, and typically that's the real issue at hand, is who should deliver. The remarks and reading the obituary and things like that can pretty much take care of themselves, but the real challenge is who's going to deliver the eulogy. And generally there is a preference, and yeah, I mean that's, and I'm not talking about badgering people and you got to choose between me and him. That's not the case, and shouldn't be the case at all. Sometimes, and sometimes, if it's in a church family and the ministers are all part of the same church and this and that and the other, then probably there shouldn't be, it shouldn't even be a question. It should sort of be, when the minister, if there's 3 or 5 of them, if they get together, there ought to be some general, like, yeah, you're the one that should be delivering this eulogy. I was asked one time to preach a funeral for somebody in the church, a church member whose sister had passed away, and because the member of my church was the one who was responsible for the making the arrangements and all that. Her brother was the one that was responsible for making all those arrangements. They asked me to preach the funeral. There was another minister who had pastored her, and long after she stopped being able to physically attend church, had continued to visit her as a shut-in. And I'll tell you, I'm talking with 20 years of experience looking backwards. There's no reason for me to have preached that funeral. And I should have politely deferred to the family and said, listen, this brother knows. I didn't know her. I mean, I knew the members of my family that were making the arrangements and that asked me to preach. I knew them, and my ministry was to them. But I didn't know this woman. I couldn't honor her life. The remarks that he made, when he read the obituary and read some scripture and said some things, the things that he said were much more meaningful than anything that I said. So I'm telling you, that's at least one time that I've made the mistake of not of deferring to the family when really, now I know, and there are plenty of times now I'll ask a family, is there somebody else that is, and especially if it's somebody that I don't know, maybe there's somebody in a family that is more, I'll say a few words, I'll, have a devotion or bring them, whatever, but is there somebody in a family, and somebody else that, somebody that knows this person better than I do, who's more qualified to speak about their life than I am, and so, you're working these things out, and as you're following up with the family. So, any questions about you? Does that make sense? We'll talk about preparing for the service itself. What do you do after the arrangements have been made, but before the service actually begins? And so, we looked at what do you do prior to the arrangements being made. Now that the arrangements have been made, what am I supposed to do to prepare for the service? First of all, collaborate with other participants. And so, that is, contact the musicians and the singers, any additional ministers or speakers who will also participate in the services, and make clear the role that each person will play. There's no reason to, and I know how some people do it. But listen, there is no reason to be at a funeral visitation an hour before the service starts or 30 minutes before the service starts and start talking about who's going to do what and this and that and the other. That should take place. Our priority at the visitation ought to be minister to the family, not planning a funeral. So make sure that everybody knows what page they're on with, and who's going to do what role that each person is going to have. Make sure that everybody clearly understands. There's nothing worse than showing up at a funeral thinking you're going to read the obituary and find out you're bringing the message. I've done that before. And you certainly don't want to come prepared to deliver the eulogy and then find out somebody else is prepared to also deliver the eulogy. You don't need two. You don't want two sermons at the funeral. So make sure that everybody knows what role that they're going to play. And again, if you're the one delivering the eulogy, then chances are most time, let me rephrase it. Sometimes when you're the one delivering the eulogy, you're sort of the one that's planning. You're sort of the master of ceremonies. Other times, maybe you're pastoring the church and a former pastor's been invited, or some pastor that's a dear friend of the family, or maybe their family themselves, they're invited, and your role is to be the facilitator. Sometimes you're called upon maybe to do a funeral out of town or something. You're going to preach a funeral out of town and you don't know what the particular local funeral customs are, this and that and the other. So you really are going to depend on somebody else. Maybe you just got to town for the visitation or whatever, and somebody else has been coordinating, getting things planned. Sometimes our role is going to change in facilitating this funeral. So sometimes you're planning it, and sometimes you're a part of the plan. And the key is just to make sure that everybody is communicating with one another. And begin working on an order of service. So you're soliciting music from the family. Always ask when the family starts talking about the funeral arrangements, and we want you to have a part. We want you to preach the funeral, or we want you to take care of it, or whatever. And when we start talking about music, sometimes they'll say, we want so and so to sing. Other times you say, well, is there particular, is there somebody you want to? Sometimes they'll say, well, just get some people in the church to sing. And generally that means I'm going to ask, was there any songs in particular that you want sung? And then we'll determine who's going to sing based on, who sings that song or what have you. Or who's available. Sometimes if the funeral's during the day, people work, it may not be that everybody that is available to participate. So you're beginning to work on an order of service, determining who's going to do what and when they're going to do it, and getting the music. I generally will ask the family, is there anything in particular that you'd like for me to read? Maybe there's a passage of Scripture that is particularly meaningful. Sometimes family wants the obituary read. Most of the time. So a lot of times anymore it's getting to the place where a lot of families don't need the obituary read. We're determining what, is there a particular piece of poetry maybe, or somebody in the family that would like to say a few words. Maybe there's a grandchild that would like to say a few things to honor, Papa, or maybe if they can't say it, they'd like to at least, write it down, and then somebody else will read it. So we're trying to gather in, all of the components, getting the family thinking as they've made the arrangements, and now we're trying to plan this funeral before we get to the last thing you want is somebody to walk up to you, 5 minutes before the funeral starts and say, will you read this? Or come to you and say, hey, we just realized Dad's favorite song was, can you all sing this? And, you don't know it, you don't have words to it. And so, getting as much information ahead of time as you possibly can makes for a smooth funeral ceremony. And then, sometimes you have to coordinate the meal plans when you're going to get together afterwards, maybe after the burial, the family's going to get together for dinner. And so you may ask, sometimes multiple churches are involved, and sometimes, rather than everybody cooking, maybe the day of the visitation and then not having anything fresh, to eat on the day of the funeral, churches will get together and say, well, we'll cook one day, you cook another day. But making sure that that's coordinated with who else is participating. Let's talk about preparing for prayer. Sometimes you're called. Did you have a question about that, Nick?
Yeah. If you're approached, like say you've got the order of service together and you're approached and they throw a wrench in the works, how do you handle that?
It really depends on who you're approached by.
Okay.
I mean, you want to be a little more specific,
Right,
or
I
just?
mean, like, let's say you had an order of service laid out, someone in the family didn't like it and come to you the day of and was like, hey, can you switch this up? I mean, do you just honor what they say, or do you say, hey, you know, this was pre-planned, or?
Well, I mean, typically, you know, the biggest question is who's the one that's making the arrangements?
Right.
And you know, and I defer to my buddy, you know, Bill Bashaya. Sometimes there's some tension in families, you know, and sometimes that creates an issue and what have you. And you know, and from the funeral director's perspective, whoever's paying the bill is the one that's making the decisions. You know what I'm saying? And so, you know, that's the way that the funeral business operates. And you know, when you're in the ministry, when you're trying to honor someone's life, you want to be as respectful as possible. Now, if it's something, and I guess the thing is, if somebody, you know, whoever called you and asked you, you know, to do this funeral, whoever, you know, told you, I want you to handle the funeral, you know, if they're the one that comes to you at the last minute and says, can you do this? Then, yeah, by all means, you do whatever you can. Now, sometimes it's something that can't be, you know, it depends on what the request is. And I know the answer is very, very general. You know, you do your very best to accommodate the family. Now, if it's somebody else that comes along, and you know maybe there's some tension or this and that and the other, my general, you know, reaction at first is to go to the person who talked to me at first and said, hey, you know, Tony wants me to, you know, to read this scripture, or, you know, wanted me to add this song or whatever, and you know, what do you think? And typically, you know, by this point in time, you know, if there is tension, a lot of times families are willing to just, you know, let's get through this service the best we can get through this service, and they'll accommodate any way that they can accommodate. But rather than, the last thing I would do is just do it on my own. Without, you know, without talking to, you know, last thing I want to do is isolate and offend someone who I'm trying to minister to. You know, you're not going to comfort anybody by sneaking around them, or you know, or you know, they're going to sit mad, and they may not even blame you, but they're going to be mad at whoever they know, you know, did this to you, and so, you know, their heart is closed to receiving the healing that you're trying to give, and so it's counterproductive. And so, I mean, you know, my suggestion is go to the person who made the arrangements and just say, you know, is this something that we can, you know, what can we do? And you're going to get all kinds of, you know, sometimes people want the obituary modified, you know, in different ways, and this and that and the other, and you know, and depending on the appropriate nature, and sometimes the, you know, the obituary says it the way it does because the family wrote it that way, and that's the way they want it read. And so, you know, and then with anything else, whether it's a song or whatever. So, let's talk about preparing for prayer. Sometimes you're called upon to pray. You know, and it may be that, you know, you've been asked to say a few words and offer a prayer, or maybe you're just maybe you're praying in you know, before you do anything else. And so I want to talk about prayer. You know, prayer is an important component of a funeral ceremony. And just say, first of all, that all genuine prayer is directed to the Lord. It is understood that God is not particularly impressed with our eloquence as much as He is the sincerity of our heart. You know, we've told used the illustration before about President Nixon inviting a group of men to the White House for prayer, and I believe it was, or for breakfast, and I believe it was Billy Graham that he asked to say the blessing over the food, and Dr. Graham was at the other end of the table, and he prayed, bless the food and whatever, and when he was finished, he said, amen. The president, you know, said, I'm sorry, Reverend, we couldn't hear you down here. And the evangelist said, I wasn't talking to you, Mr. President. And I understand that all prayer is directed to the Lord. And so genuine prayer comes from the heart. God is not at all impressed with our you know, eloquence. But, you know, however, our lack of preparedness probably does not impress God either. And so, you know, you have to consider that public prayers, there is a considerable difference in what we pray in a public prayer, public setting, and the prayers that we pray when we're in the altar or we're in our prayer closet and we're talking to God. public prayers, when we're praying in front of people, on behalf of other people, public prayers have the capacity to solicit listeners to assent to the prayer themselves. So that as someone else is praying a public prayer, we're listening to that prayer, and as we hear what they're saying, our heart is being in tune with it. It's like I've told that story I know about a revival service up at White Rock years ago, when Brother Rowe was pastoring there. Sister Rowe got down at the altar to pray during prayer time, and somebody knelt down beside her, and they spent all that time listening. They spent all that time listening to Sister Rowe pray. What a beautiful prayer warrior she is, and listening to the beautiful prayer she prayed. And when she was finished, they just kind of said, "Amen," what she said. And there's something about our public prayers that has that same capacity. When somebody is praying a prayer that when something is said that we agree with, we assent to that. It's as if we're praying along with them. And the same thing is true. I promise. If you say something stupid while you're praying loud, or you say something inappropriate, or you fumble all over your words, it has the same capacity to turn people off, to close them to our prayer. Because, well, that's not what I would say. I wouldn't say that. And so we've got to be very, very careful what we say and how we say it when we're praying in public. And so my recommendation, and there have been plenty of times when I'm praying, especially if the funeral that I'm at is going to be largely attended. If I know there's going to be a lot of people sitting out there, I am more likely to write down my prayer. And I may not pray it exactly the way that I wrote it down. I may not read it right off of my page, right out of my notes or whatever. But just having thought about it ahead of time and having something written down in front of me will prevent me from rambling. The last thing you need to do is ramble, take up a lot of unnecessary. We're going to give an account, the Bible says, for every idle word that we speak. And so time is so precious in the funeral anyway, that you want every word, if possible. You want every word to be a meaningful word. And so my suggestion is write out a prayer and think about it. Rehearse it in your mind. The last thing you want to do is pray off the cuff, especially in a public setting, like whether it's a wedding or a funeral. Let's talk about preparing for the readings. Sometimes you're asked to read something, whether it's the obituary. We talked about different kinds of readings in the first session, and the way that they're used, to fulfill the purposes of the funeral. And so sometimes we're asked to read poems, or maybe we're asked to read some memories that someone else has written. So what do you do as you're preparing for these readings? First of all, rehearse the reading aloud on your own until you're comfortable reading in public. Now, if it's Scripture, again, you're going to be reading the passage of Scripture, what have you. Maybe it's a passage you've read oftentimes. Don't let that hinder you from reading it again. Practice it again. Prepare for it again. Read it out loud. There's a difference in reading it out loud and reading it to yourself. So, get comfortable with it. Now, if it's not Scripture, Scripture tends to be one of those things that we, as ministers, we're in the habit of reading Scripture publicly, and so it may not require near as much attention. But other things like obituaries and poems, or someone else's letters, make sure that you have read them, and are prepared to read them out loud. One of the things, sometimes if somebody, for example, writes, a letter to Dad, or they record some memories of Grandma or whatever that they can't say themselves, but they'd like for somebody to read them, and you're asked to read something that somebody else has written, or maybe they wrote a poem about Grandma going to heaven, or whatever the case is, and you're asked to read that. The last thing you need to do is get up in the pulpit, having never read this before, and try to read it publicly. Sometimes you're going to struggle with reading their writing. Maybe if it's handwritten, read it again and again and again, and get comfortable with it. And the same thing is, sometimes these things aren't, if it's something personal written, sometimes it's not given to you until the funeral. Before. But get off alone. Get your flower on your jacket, and then go sit down with it and make sure that you know what all the words are, and that you know what's being said. If requested, be prepared to briefly explain the significance of the piece that you're reading. I've been asked to read this poem because, Susie wanted us to, this was real meaningful to her, or she wrote it, or whatever. This was Papaw's favorite verse, or whatever. And be, sometimes the significance doesn't even have to be explained. And in other times, maybe it's appropriate to explain it. So be prepared if necessary, to explain that the reason I'm reading this is because of whatever. And then the third thing is, if the obituary is to be read, be certain that you know how to pronounce every name of the person and the city that are listed. So, make sure you've read the obituary before you get up. And I always, sometimes again, the funeral home will give you the obituary at the visitation, or sometimes they'll give it to you prior to the service itself. I always look at it in the newspaper. Sometimes the copy that's in the newspaper is not the same copy you're going to read. But, look at it and make sure that you know how to stand. If you have any doubt, don't guess. Ask somebody that knows. I mean, if you come across a name, the last thing you need to do is, while you're reading the obituary of some loved one, and there's someone who's close enough to that person whose name is mentioned in the obituary, the last thing you need to do is be disrespectful to that person by messing their name up. And so just ask, hey, listen, how does, what is this? And sometimes, and don't assume anything. Don't assume that you know what. Oh yeah, I know lots of people by that name. It may be pronounced different in one place or the other. So don't be afraid to ask, or even the name of a city. Ask. You want, when you're up in front of people, publicly reading in front of them, you want to give them the impression that you're smarter than you sound when you butcher words as you're reading them in public. So prepare yourself. Let's talk about preparing the music. There's an important part of the service is oftentimes the music that is chosen. So let's talk about preparing it. If you're asked to sing a song, rehearse that song until you're confident you can provide the family with an experience that will produce comfort and meaning. Do I need to say that again? Rehearse the song until you're confident that you can provide the family with an experience that will produce comfort and meaning. You want to do the song well. Now, sometimes, do your best to accommodate the specific requests of the family. If the family says, "Hey, we really want you to sing such and such," do your best to sing that song, but also know your limits. If the song that they've asked you to sing is something that you can't play, or that nobody else can, I don't really, that's not, that song's too high for my vocal range, or whatever the case is, then there's certainly nothing wrong with politely letting them know, I can't sing that. Now, now what you ought to do is you ought to recommend something else. Maybe there's a song that is similar, you've looked at the lyrics or whatever, you know the song that they've requested. I can't sing this song, but I sing one called whatever, and give them a few lines, and I don't sing it to them, but give them a few lines and give them the gist of what the song is about. Or suggest someone who does. I don't sing that song, but somebody somebody else in the church does, or maybe they can sing it, and if you and I'll sing something else, or whatever the case is. But the last thing you want to do, obviously, is get up and butcher Papaw's favorite song. Is not going to give any comfort to that family. So you want to make sure that the song the music is supposed to be meaningful and comforting. So do your best to accommodate the requests of the family, but also know your limits. And then be sure to take the music and the words with you to the service. If you sang it 100 times, don't take anything for granted that once you get up in a funeral setting that all of a sudden, the second verse, the words are not going to just leave you. So be prepared be prepared to do your very best in the songs that you're singing. Let's talk about preparing your remarks. Sometimes the family will ask you to say a few words. Now, understand what you've been asked to do. If the family asks you to read the obituary, maybe say a few words. or if they've asked you to pray and say a few words, or they've asked you to sing a song and say a few words, understand what you've been asked to do. If you're asked to say a few words, then honor that request. And only say a few words. Generally, my recommendation is that if you've been asked to say a few words, or if you've been asked to give some remarks or whatever, you ought to be able to fit everything that you're going to say on a single sheet of paper that's typewritten, and in front of you. You ought to be able to include everything that you're going to say in that one sheet of paper. And so if what you've got to say doesn't fit on one sheet of paper, then chances are that you've got too much to say. And I know sometimes when I say that, sometimes if you're sharing an anecdote or something, you're telling some story or whatever that fits with the remarks that you're making, then that story, the details of that story may be too much to fit on a sheet of paper, and you may only have on your paper tell the story about the time that me and whoever, the decedent or whatever, when we did such and such. And so the story itself may be a little more wordy than that. But if you're going to tell stories, if you're going to tell us, then only tell one. This is not a time. A good funeral is going to be long enough to be meaningful, but short enough that it doesn't take all the meaning out of what is actually said. When you outline your remarks and then spend time editing your words in such a way, you ought to do it in such a way that even if you never got the chance to say them, I'm talking about having your remarks laid out in such a way that even if you didn't get the chance to say them, that somebody else could read them and hear your heart speak. So that if you didn't get the chance, it ought to be, and I'm not, for whatever reason you didn't make it to the funeral, but you could send your remarks and they could read it, and maybe that's not even the case, but your preparation ought to be such that you know what you're going to say and why it's relevant, why it's significant, and meaningful. Again, words do not have to be lengthy to be meaningful. It's not our wordiness that is going to matter to folks. It's going to be it's going to be what is actually said. Unnecessary words are unnecessary. So cut them out. If there's no purpose in our story, if the anecdote that came to our mind, there's some stories that just don't need to be told at the funeral. Maybe tell them some other time or some other place, but not at the funeral ceremony. Let's talk about preparing the message. Collect anecdotes, study Scripture, pray, begin organizing your thought. Again, these are things prior to the funeral itself. After the arrangements have been made, you're the one going to be bringing the message. So begin gathering together your stories. Study and sometimes you're spending time with a family that you don't, because it's somebody that died that you don't know, and you're having to gather stories, glean stories from them, and so you're jotting things down, collecting memories and what have you. You're looking into Scripture, you're praying. God will give you some clear direction for the message. You have to depend on Him. So begin constructing an outline, and then group your scriptures and your illustrations together in a logical manner. Start putting together the message in the way that God gives it to you. Attend the visitation, and then continue gleaning stories. There may be something told at the visitation that you hadn't heard before. Maybe a relationship with somebody that you wasn't really thinking about, whatever, and they tell a story and it fits, and it may illustrate a point exactly that you wanted to make. And there's another. Now you can include somebody else in the meaningful in this meaningful eulogy by sharing their story and also illustrating the truth from the person who died from their life. Again, the message ought to focus on the person who has died. And then finish preparing your remarks, editing and fine-tuning your notes. Go back, check your grammar and your pronunciation. Make sure that what you've got is polished and is as polished as you can get it. You know, when I preach a sermon on Sunday, you know, my young preachers all the time marvel at how scant my notes can tend to be sometimes. You know, bare bones. I don't need a whole lot of you know, a whole lot of notes to preach an hour sermon, really, for that matter. When I'm preaching a funeral, my notes are not like my notes when I'm preaching a Sunday night service. You know, preaching a revival or something. My notes for a funeral tend to be a lot more manuscript. There's some things that I've thought about that I want to say, and sometimes I want to say them. I want to say them a specific way, and I want to say them at a specific time during the course of the message. You know, the timeliness. You know, you can have oh man, a perfect phrase. What a great line. And say it at the wrong time, and it just, you know, and undo undo the profundity of what it was that you were saying. What should your message include? First of all, it should include a recognition of pain. There are people here at this funeral who are hurting, and to not acknowledge that would be a disservice to them. So, you know, in your message, acknowledge and recognize that people are hurting. All throughout the Psalms, you know, Psalmist David over and over again lets you know that he is hurting for a variety of reasons. You know, the second thing, remembrance for good. People should be remembered for their good. Remember the thing the prayer that Nehemiah prayed at the end of the book of Nehemiah. He prays, remember me, oh my God, for good. Don't blot out the good deeds that I've done. Everybody deserves to be remembered for good. So the funeral is not a time to talk about somebody's weaknesses or talk about their failures or what have you. Remember them for good. There's something good that ought to be able to be said about everybody. And at the same time, it ought to be honest. You know, that you should never have people leaving the funeral saying, boy, that wasn't the John I knew. You know, the preacher getting we have this capacity sometimes to focus on good to the point where we paint a picture of a saint, and the guy wasn't a saint. If he's not a saint, then don't make him a saint. You know, if he struggled, you can talk about the good things that he did, and at the same time acknowledge his struggles. You know, so be honest. And remember for good. There's a delicate tension between those two extremes, and so be sure to recognize that. Again, everybody who dies is not a good, faithful church member. You know, as much as we might want them to be, or we might like to look back and remember them that way. And so remember them honestly. The message should also include appropriate humor. You know, use humor if it's appropriate. You know, and certainly depending on the nature of the person who died, the circumstances of their death, and what have you. You know, the place for humor can vary from one funeral service to the next. You know, but someone who really enjoyed life and who loved to laugh and cut up and this and that. You know, if something funny isn't said at the funeral, then, but at the same time, we're not being funny just for the sake of being funny. You know, the humorous story ought to be used in such a way that it illustrates the truth that we're trying to convey about the person's life. And so, you know, it's not a place for a stand-up comedian, but don't be afraid to use humor. A good funeral will have you crying through your tears. I mean, you'll be laughing while you're wiping the tears out of your eyes. And then offer genuine hope. You know, every funeral message should offer genuine hope. That's not talking about a false hope. Sometimes we're burying people that did not leave a strong testimony and faith in Jesus Christ. They're in the hands of a just God, and you know, where they're at, their eternal soul and this and that and the other is maybe not the thing that's going to bring them hope, but Christ can give people hope. And so offer genuine hope. You know, the thief died on the cross and asked Jesus to remember him when he came into paradise. And maybe his mother wasn't present. Maybe that thief's mother wasn't present to hear him pray that prayer. But it was the hope of every mother. You know, she raised him right. It's the hope of every mother that our loved ones, our children, give their heart to the Lord and die knowing Jesus and leave the world with hope. And so if there's hope, offer hope. And and at the same time, don't give false. Make sure it's genuine. Let's talk about putting the preparation into action. What do you do on the day of the services? Let's talk about the funeral services themselves. First of all, arrive early. There's nothing worse than the preacher showing up late. Bill's mentioned on several occasions to me about how it's becoming a more and more a problem with funerals, where the funeral's supposed to start at 11 o'clock, and sometimes the principal family isn't even there. People are showing up later and later for funerals. 11:15, they start rolling in or what have you. And so the funeral should never be waiting on the minister to get there. So be there early. Again, we talk about sometimes there's accommodations, that are being made at the last minute. Maybe something come up with a singer or something, or a particular song they couldn't get, or somebody we thought about, we're adding, we wanted Cousin Sue to, sing at this funeral too, and we're going to try to work her in. And so get there early enough that you can handle any last minute changes that need to be made. Over and over and over again. We change orders of service and we change songs, and sometimes you just have to accommodate the circumstances. So be there early so that you can do that. If the service is at the church, then assist the funeral home staff in any way necessary. If you're the pastor of the church, and if you're going to open the church up, you got to be there early, be there and be prepared to help the funeral staff. Sometimes furniture needs to be moved, or what have you. Communion table maybe needs to be moved, or the temperature needs to be adjusted, or there may be a dozen different things that need to take place. Making sure the PA system is turned on, and all these other kinds of things. The appropriate microphones are on, and all this. Making sure that stuff is done so that the funeral can begin on time without any issue. Coordinate with the funeral director and the other participants on an order of service for the ceremony. If you're the one that's been facilitating the whole funeral, you should have an order of service printed, prepared, and ready to hand out to everybody that's singing, everybody that's going to talk. Make sure the funeral director, understands the order of service that's going to take place, and so that everybody who's participating understands what to expect and when to expect it. And then give your best effort and rely on the Comforter. It's going to take the power of the Holy Spirit to minister to people. We're just agents of the Holy Spirit, and He's using us in His service. And so, we give our very best effort and trust the Lord to anoint it. Let's talk about the funeral services. Make sure you have communicated with the funeral director and the other participants how the service will be concluded. How are we going to end this thing? So that you shouldn't need to say at the end of the funeral, at this time I'm going to ask the funeral director to come back and just give it all to him. There ought to be a more meaningful way to conclude the service. You ought to communicate with, and I generally will tell the funeral director, we're going to play this last song, and at the end of the song, they're going to play it all the way through, and then we're ready. Sometimes the funeral director will come in and get us and bring us, the ministers down to the head of the casket or what have you. And we want this song sang all the way through. It's part of the service. And then the musicians will continue to play, or maybe they'll sing some more songs after that while the family is viewing, or whatever the case is. Sometimes there's not going to be a viewing after the funeral. After the service is concluded, and so you need to know, what we're going to do at the end of the, sometimes you just dismiss the family. Maybe there's a memorial service, there's no body present, and you're not going to the cemetery. How are we going to conclude this thing? How are we going to wrap it up? So be sure that you communicate. Sometimes when it's a member of the church, been a member for a long time or something like that, we'll do a transfer of membership. We'll transfer their membership to heaven, and I will come down during the last song and place the membership transfer form in the casket and just stand out, and I'll let the director know I'm going to come on down and I'll just stay there rather than to go, and so make sure the key is to communicate with the funeral director so that they know what's going on. Be prepared to greet family and friends at the close of the service. whether that's at the casket or whether that's in the back of the building, depending on how the service is going to close. Again, sometimes there's no viewing. Sometimes sometimes the family views and then everybody sits back down or whatever. But be prepared to greet family and friends. Some folks will want to shake your hand and tell you it was a good word or whatever, or give you a God, and you give them back a God bless you or what have you. Sometimes sometimes it's appropriate to hug folks. Sometimes they'll just kind of look at you and walk on their way. People's needs are different, and you respect whatever their needs are, but be prepared to greet the family and the friends at the end of the service. And then again, ascertain the expectations of the funeral director in regards to your duties after the closing of the funeral service and before the committal service begins. So make sure you understand what am I supposed to do now? Now that the funeral is over and I've shaken hands with everybody and everybody's left the building, what do you want me to do now? Now generally as a minister, I will stay with the casket and until the funeral director comes and closes the casket and takes it out to the hearse, and I'll generally lead the way as the pallbearers carry the casket to the hearse to make preparations for the cemetery. But funeral customs are different geographically, and funeral customs are different sometimes even from funeral home to funeral home. So be sure that you understand what the funeral director expects you to do while they're, during this time frame before the procession will start to the cemetery and the services come to a conclusion. Let's talk about the committal. Understand that the order of service and the role that you will play at the graveside and work with others who will also participate. Sometimes there's multiple people involved in the funeral, and then sometimes those multiple ministers will be involved at the cemetery. Or sometimes one minister is taking care of the committal service entirely. Sometimes at the committal service, the minister may say a few words, maybe read another scripture, do a formal committal service, and then ask somebody to close in prayer. Sometimes if it's a military funeral, veteran, the honor guard may be there to give them a 21-gun salute, and the honor guard has their own committal service that they'll do. So understand what's going to take place, and be sure. A lot of times we're guilty of just kind of winging the committal service when we get there. We don't really give a lot of thought to it. Hadn't really given, irregardless. Understand this is a significant time. We talked about the purposes of the committal in the first session, and the role that it's playing in facilitating the family in their grieving process and their mourning process. And so we can't afford for any part of the funeral to be neglected. So know what you're supposed to do so that you can and be prepared to do it. If appropriate, connect your remarks at the cemetery to your message at the funeral. Sometimes I have had the opportunity to throw one more point, to the message. Now again, if you're going to do that, if you're going to connect your remarks at the cemetery you're not preaching, point number 5 now at the cemetery. It's not a fully developed point. You're just making one more statement, connecting it to the things that you said earlier and tying it all together. Hopefully it has something to do with the resurrection and our hope that we're burying this loved one with. But if it's appropriate, if it works, then connect your remarks to them. Tie it together. This is especially helpful, sometimes when the funeral, we're going to have a lot more funerals at night where the family's burying, the next day. The committal service takes place the following day. And so maybe, this is your last chance to leave the family with something that they will remember. Now, regardless of whether you use a traditional liturgy or you personalize the graveside service entirely, be brief. The committal service is not a place, for 3 more songs and and another sermon and this and that and the other and I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but I've heard horror stories of committal services that lasted longer than some funerals did. Now, I also showed up at the committal service and had things prepared, and then when I got there on a cold winter day, underneath the tent and it was spitting snow or this and that and the other, and we were underneath the tent, and the cloud cover and the tent cover was enough that whatever sunlight might have been there didn't get underneath the tent, and the cold wind blowing on the hilltop caused folks to... I have cut things short when I got to the cemetery too, just because of the weather. You know, it doesn't do you any good. It doesn't matter how profound you think you might be or how eloquent you might be at the funeral, at the cemetery. It doesn't matter what you got to say. If people are freezing to death, they're not going to hear you. And so being brief is especially important depending on the weather conditions. So realize that. You know, if it's pouring rain, those tents are small. Everybody can't get up underneath it. Folks are standing around under umbrellas and this and that and the other, and they're getting cold and the wind's blowing on them. So don't take advantage of people's time. If you didn't get to say it at the funeral, it probably doesn't, it probably doesn't need to be said. So make sure that your words are brief. Now, I will say that a short word at the graveside service, that last word, has the potential to be the word that is most remembered. So rather than just doing this stuff off the cuff and this and that and the other, I think about one committal service in particular where where I was burying one of my best friends, and it fell on me to close the committal service out. And I remembered the word in particular that I said. And my best friend's dad, the way he responded, let me know that he was connecting with what and it didn't say much. I promise it didn't say much. But it was, the words weren't lengthy, but they were meaningful. And that's the key. I did that funeral for Papa Hawk a few years back, and I asked his grandson, on the way to the cemetery, or maybe the day before, so you want to say something. And so I asked him again on our way to the graveyard, and no, he didn't want to say anything. And on the way back to the church, he's telling me, he said, well, if I thought about it, he said, if I would have said something, this is what I would have said. And he told me what he would have said, and it was like somebody punched me in the gut, because he said more in that short, and that's what I told him. You said more in that one phrase than I said during the entire funeral ceremony. And so again, your words don't have to be lengthy to be meaningful. And so saying something meaningful at the cemetery has that capacity to be the one thing that the family most remembers. So let the Lord lead you into saying something wise. And then the other thing, serve the family's interests at the graveside. Sometimes families, their customs are different. This and that. Every family will have its own unique customs. So do whatever you can to accommodate the family. I've had family members ask, do you care to stay until they're buried, or do you care? And or stay until they're lowered into the ground, stay till the vault's sealed, or stay till I've had a couple of times where families said, if you don't care, do you care to stay till they're stay as long as the the funeral director's there. And you know what? It's not really that big a deal. It doesn't take that long. And so whatever the case, if it's meaningful to the family to have somebody there, then I'll do whatever the family needs done to try to help them out. Let's talk about the gathering. A lot of times after the graveside, family gather together back at the church, or they gather together at somebody's home to have a meal. Make an appearance at the gathering. Whether and maybe even offer a blessing over the meal. You come together, pray one more prayer, asking God to bless the food, and also to continue to comfort the family as they remember the person who has died. They're sharing stories, and be sure to thank the people who have prepared it. If you're at the church and there were people from the church, maybe some of the ladies in the church, or they're serving, be sure to thank them, and then do that again publicly in the next church service. If your relationship with the family warrants it, then eat with the family. You know, again, your relationship with the family is going to change the way you minister to. You know, there have been times where you know, I have felt like, and family members have made me feel like part of the family. And so to show up, pray a prayer, and then disappear would have been, you know, rude and insensitive. And of course, people also respect your time, and they know that as a pastor, sometimes you get called upon to do. You know, there are things. I've left the graveside service and went straight to a wedding, you know, before. And so, you know, sometimes, or I've left the graveside service and went straight to the hospital. On at least 2 different occasions that come to my mind right away, where someone was in an immediate emergency situation. And so, you know, your time dictates a lot of what you can do. So if your relationship with the family warrants it, then stay and eat with the family. If your relationship with them doesn't warrant it, then don't stay. You know, don't make the pastor should not be the first one in line with a plate of food. I'll sample this all for you and make sure it's, you know, you're not there to be ministered unto, but to minister. So you know, let your relationship dictate your you know, your response. I did a funeral one time where the guy who sang at the funeral was a man that sold, you know, music at the flea market, and the man that died had bought several of his tapes through the years, just loved to hear him sing, and the family was able to contact him, get him to come, and he sang at the funeral, and then he went to the funeral dinner, and he set up his table of tapes and stuff to sell at the funeral dinner. Don't do that. You know, our products, you know, we got t-shirts, I'm signing black and white glossies. You know, that's not the purpose of the funeral dinner. But be available for family members who might wish to speak to you about their grief, your message, or other concerns. People, you know, in this informal setting that the dinner provides, it may be that people want to come up and talk to you about the person who's died. They're looking for comfort, or maybe they want to talk to you about your message. They want to continue to, you know, to be ministered to. I've had a lot of people tell me in those situations, you know, I know I need to get my heart right with the Lord. I need to get back in church, or whatever the case is. And so take advantage of that opportunity to talk to them. Witness, you know, evangelism is not, you know, there's no place for evangelism in the funeral service. But in that intimate setting, one-on-one, when you're talking to the family in the, you know, at the dinner or this, that, and they come and talk to you, then yes, by all means, that's a place for soul winning. When you're talking to someone one-on-one about where they're at with the Lord. Let's talk about our continued ministry to bereaved to close. We're talking about what do you do after the services are completed. First of all, follow up with the mourners. And you may, you know, again, determine the appropriate time and the manner to contact family members and assure them of your continued prayer and support. Now, sometimes that means, you know, after the dinner, a few hours after the dinner, you know, there have been times I've showed up at somebody's house just a few hours later. You know, they've still got family in town, or this, that, and the other, show up and say, you know, I just want to come by and see you, see how you guys are doing. Sometimes it's the next day. Sometimes it's a visit. Sometimes it's a phone call. And again, your relationship and the circumstances of death and this, that, are going to dictate a lot of these things. Make sure when you do that, you know, you're showing up to assure them of your continued prayer and your continued support. If there's things that you can do in the days to come, there's, you know, a lot of things that still have to be done. Any way that you can help the family, make sure you are pledging to do that. But then also make sure that practical needs are being met. You know, grass still needs to be cut. You know, bills still need to be paid. There's a lot of things there's a lot of practical needs that are you know, that are going to take place. So make sure that you're doing what you can to help fulfill some of those needs, arranging for, you know, different things to take place. And then long-term ministry. Remember that losing someone you love changes your life forever. Mourning does not end at the cemetery or when out-of-town guests return home or when local friends cease coming over regularly. You know, losing somebody is something that changes you forever. So remember, long-term ministry is going to be just as important as providing a meaningful funeral ceremony. So remember holidays and remember anniversaries. Remind mourners that you're praying for them at these difficult times. You know, the best thing that you can do for somebody is to say, I know this is the first Christmas without, you know, without your dad, and I just wanted you to know that, you know, we're thinking about you. We've got that on our mind. We're praying for you as your family gets to. Sometimes the next holiday is the first time they're getting together. I know Mother's Day's coming up. This is the first Mother's Day without your mom, and I know it's going to be emotionally difficult for you, and I just want you to know that somebody's praying for you to help you get through these tough times. Memorial Day, when the family's going to decorate the grave. There's all kinds of family get-togethers where the family's going to be getting back together for, you know, those first few times they're getting together. You know, without that person in their life, it can be a real emotionally difficult thing to handle. And then those birthdays, when the decedent's birthday. I mean, you got the obituary in your hands. You know, mark it on your calendar, put it in your phone, such and such birthday, and make a note to get a hold of somebody, to call them the day before, or to call them that morning, or send a message or something, say, hey, I know you're thinking about, you know, Martha today or whatever, and I just wanted you to know, you know, just thinking about you. I know it's, know it's a challenge. I just want you to know, praying for you. And those anniversaries of those deaths. You know, when you remember that time of year when someone has died, and you let that family know, hey, I know it's been a year now, and I know those anniversaries. And I'm going to tell you something. The circumstances of death changes the way that we grieve. And a lot of times, there's some people that for up to a year, every Tuesday is hard. Because Tuesday's the day they lost, you know, some family member. You know, or the 5th day of the month, or you know, whatever the case is. So sometimes it's not even that annual anniversary that really, it's those reminders on a regular basis that, you know, that these times are tough. And so just letting them know that somebody is praying for them has that capacity to encourage them and lift them up and build them up at the time that they need it most. And keep records. You know, use a filing system to keep your notes, your funeral materials, your other keepsakes and mementos. I've got a file folder for every funeral that I've ever done. And in it, I keep everything in it that is pertinent to that funeral. Whether that's my sermon notes, the obituary, you know, maybe the newspaper clippings. Sometimes people die from circumstances that's talked about in the newspaper. That newspaper article, you know, is in there along with that. And anything else that is related to that, you know, to that death, or to that few keepsakes from the family. A thank you card. Generally, a minister, a lot of times you get a thank you card for participating. Sometimes it's got an honorarium in it, or sometimes it's just a thank you. I'll stick those thank you cards in there with that family. It serves a couple of purposes. Number one, it's for my own sake. It's for my own records, and I like having it to where I can go back and reflect and look on. You know, it's certainly good for me. And then also, there is the capacity that at some point down the road, there is a family member who just would like to, you know, go back. And I was able just a year ago to help a family here in town that's connected some to our church. Their mother got killed in a car wreck, you know, 10 or 15 years ago or so now. I can't remember how long ago it's been. But those girls were all young. And so a couple of them, because they were in the accident also, a couple of girls didn't get to go to the funeral. They have no memory whatsoever. You know, they weren't at the funeral, don't know anything at all about it. And, you know, that complicates grief, obviously, when you're not able to participate in a meaningful funeral ceremony. And so, you know, here's one daughter in particular that didn't have a copy of her mom's obituary. She'd never seen the newspaper article that talked about the wreck. And knew nothing at all about the funeral. And so I was able to go down to the library, make a copy of from the microfilm of the newspaper article and the obituary from the paper, go down to the funeral home, and they pulled the file out, and the file had not only the printed obituary from the funeral itself, but they also made me copies of everything that was in the folder, including when the family came in to make the arrangements. And then I was able to email the minister who preached the funeral, and he had his funeral notes. They were somewhat sketchy, but it was an outline. It was put together enough that, you know, at least it was something from the funeral. and he had that outline still saved on his computer and was able to email it to me to print and give to this family. So you know what I'm saying, you never know at what time there's somebody that's connected to that family that, you know, would just like to have a little something that, you know, I'm going through right now some of Luther Gibson's manuscripts back here in the office that from some of his preaching for years, and nearly 1,000 sermons or more that are back there. But one of the things that I uncovered was the funeral service that he preached, the funeral for Sister Annie McKinney, Sister Rose's mother, Brother Earl McKinney's mother, and he preached that funeral. And so, you know, those funeral notes are here, some, you know, 50 years later, you know, to be able, not only for the children, but she's got grandchildren and great-grandchildren that never knew her, that here's a little memento. And so, you know, you never know what your records are going to do to be a help, to be a blessing, to continue to minister to somebody a long time after after the grass is growing at their gravesite. And you know, then the last thing I'll say is just keep on learning. We're continuing to hone our skills. I'm not an expert by any, you know, stretch of the imagination. I'm constantly learning. Part of that is about going to other funerals, learning what to do and what not to do. It's about gleaning, you know, taking what you can learn from whoever you can learn. It's about reading, and it's about getting to know people. Just being around people and making that connection with them. Any questions